Sometimes the deepest wounds are carried by the smallest hearts. When 12-year-old Fiona lost both parents to Montana's brutal winter, she learned that survival meant swallowing your tears and finding your strength. Standing at the edge of Theodore Blackwood's ranch, she clutched her only possessions in a flour sack. The wealthy rancher sat on his porch, a man who'd built walls around his heart after losing his own family. Fiona's voice was barely a whisper against the prairie wind. "I don't talk much, sir, but I can cook." Theo saw something in her quiet courage that stirred memories he'd buried deep. His simple response would bind their fates together. Two broken souls, one small ranch, and the slow healing that comes from shared meals and unspoken understanding. But would this unlikely pair find the family they'd both lost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Theodore Blackwood had not expected to see another soul on his land that March morning. The 48-year-old rancher had grown accustomed to solitude over the past 7 years, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of cattle and weather, sunrise and sunset. His ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of Montana's finest grazing land, where the Rocky Mountain foothills rolled into endless prairie under a sky so vast it seemed to dwarf human concerns into insignificance. He sat in his weathered rocking chair on the wide porch of his 2-story log home, nursing his second cup of coffee while watching the morning mist rise from the valley below. The house itself spoke of prosperity, solid timber construction, glass windows that caught the light, and a stone chimney that drew smoke straight up into the crisp air. Yet for all its comforts, the place felt hollow. Like a church after the congregation has gone home, Theo wore his usual attire, clean denim pants, a cotton shirt rolled to the elbows, and leather boots that had walked these boards countless times. Around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt collar, hung a thin gold chain that held his wife's wedding ring. He'd stopped wearing his own years ago, but hers remained close to his heart, a weight he carried both as comfort and punishment. The sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel drive made him look up. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks. A small figure walked slowly up the path, struggling with what appeared to be a heavy flour sack slung over one shoulder. As the figure drew closer, Theo realized it was a child, a girl of perhaps 12 years. With auburn hair that caught the morning light and clothing that had seen better days, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. Her dress, though clean, had been mended multiple times, and her boots were clearly too large for her feet. But there was something in the way she carried herself that spoke of determination rather than defeat. Theo set down his coffee cup and studied the approaching girl. In all his years on this land, he had never seen her before. The nearest neighbors lived 10 miles away, and children rarely traveled alone in this country. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle that leaned against the porch rail, not out of fear, but from the ingrained caution of a man who lived far from help. The girl stopped at the bottom of his porch steps and looked up at him with eyes the color of winter sage. For a long moment, neither spoke. Theo found himself looking into a face that bore the unmistakable marks of recent grief, the hollow cheeks of inconsistent meals, the shadows beneath the eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and yet something else that caught his attention. There was no pleading in her expression, no desperation. Instead, he saw a quiet dignity that reminded him of someone he had lost long ago. "Sir," she finally said, her voice carrying despite its softness, "I don't talk much, sir, but I can cook." The words hit Theo with unexpected force, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. There was no begging in her tone, no attempt to evoke pity. She was simply stating a fact, offering what she had in exchange for what she needed. It was the kind of straightforward honesty that had become rare in his experience. He studied her more carefully. Despite her obvious hardship, she stood straight and met his gaze without flinching. Her hands, he noticed, were clean despite her travels, and her hair had been braided with care. Whatever circumstances had brought her to his door, she had not lost her sense of dignity. "Where do you come from?" Theo asked, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke to anyone beyond the necessities of ranch business, and even then, his conversations with his 3 hired hands were brief and practical. "The Peterson place, up north," she replied. "My parents. They passed with the winter fever. Been walking since the thaw." Theo felt something shift in his chest. The Peterson place was nearly 40 miles away, across some of the most challenging terrain in the territory. For a child to make that journey alone spoke of either desperation or remarkable determination. Probably both. He looked at the flour sack she carried, noting how she held it protectively against her body. Whatever possessions she had managed to save from her former life were contained in that simple container. The sight stirred memories he preferred to keep buried. "What's your name?" he asked. "Fiona Peterson, sir." Fiona. He tested the name, finding it suited her somehow. "That's a good, strong name." She nodded solemnly, as if acknowledging a truth she had always known. Theo found himself at a crossroads he had not expected to face. His life had settled into patterns that served his need for isolation. He rose before dawn, tended his cattle, managed his ranch business, and sought his bed when darkness fell. The routine had kept him sane through the worst of his grief, providing structure when everything else had fallen apart. The presence of this child threatened that carefully constructed solitude. Yet something about her quiet dignity called to a part of him he thought had died with his wife. Perhaps it was the way she had not asked for charity, but had offered something in return. Perhaps it was the recognition of shared loss in her young face. Or perhaps it was simply that after 7 years of eating his own poor cooking, the promise of a decent meal held more appeal than he cared to admit. "Can you really cook?" he asked. For the first time, a small smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Yes, sir. My mama taught me well. I can make biscuits that rise proper, stew that sticks to your ribs, and pie that won't shame your table." The confidence in her voice convinced him more than any pleading could have. This was not idle boasting, but a craftsman describing their skills. Theo stood slowly, his decision made, though he could not have explained why. "Well then, Fiona Peterson, I expect you're hungry from your journey. Why don't you show me what you can do with what's in my kitchen?" The relief that washed over her face was quickly hidden, but not before he saw it. She had been more frightened than she had let on, and the realization made his chest tighten with an emotion he had not felt in years. "Thank you, sir," she said simply. "Theodore," he corrected. "Theodore Blackwood." "But most folks call me Theo," she nodded gravely, as if filing away this important information. "Mr. Theo, then?" He led her up the porch steps and through the front door into his home. The interior reflected the same comfortable prosperity as the exterior. Solid furniture built to last, a stone fireplace that could heat the main room, and windows that let in the morning light. Yet even Fiona, young as she was, could sense the emptiness that pervaded the space. The kitchen was spacious and well-appointed, with a large cast-iron stove, a pump that brought water directly to the sink, and shelves lined with dishes that rarely saw use. Theo watched as Fiona set down her flour sack and surveyed the room with the eye of a professional evaluating her workspace. "Might I wash my hands first?" she asked. "Of course." He worked the pump handle and cold, clear water flowed into the basin. She washed carefully and thoroughly, then dried her hands on a clean towel he provided. From her flour sack, she withdrew a single item, a cast-iron skillet black with age and seasoning, that had clearly seen years of faithful use. "This was my mama's," she said quietly, running her fingers along the smooth handle. "It's all I brought for cooking." The show nodded, understanding instinctively that this simple tool represented far more than its practical value. It was a connection to her lost mother, a tangible link to the life she had been forced to leave behind. So as Fiona began to work, moving through his kitchen with growing confidence, Theo found himself remembering what it felt like to have life in his home again. The sound of her quiet humming as she worked, the gentle clatter of utensils, the growing aroma of something wonderful taking shape. It all combined to create an atmosphere he had not experienced since Margaret's death. Within an hour, she had produced a breakfast that surpassed anything he had eaten in years. Fresh biscuits, light and flaky, accompanied eggs cooked to perfection and bacon crisped just right. She set the plate before him with the quiet pride of someone who knew their craft well. Theo took his first bite and closed his eyes. The food was not just well prepared. It was prepared with care, with attention to detail that spoke of love for the craft itself. Each element complemented the others, creating a harmony of flavors that transformed a simple meal into something approaching art. "This is excellent," he said, and meant it. Fiona smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "Thank you, Mr. Theo. I'm glad it pleases you." As he ate, he watched her move about his kitchen, cleaning as she worked, restoring order with the natural efficiency of someone who had been managing a household far longer than her years would suggest. There was something peaceful about her presence, something that filled the silence of his home without demanding conversation. When he finished eating, she had already prepared a plate for herself and sat quietly at the far end of the table. Her manners were impeccable. She waited until he had finished before beginning her own meal, ate without haste but with obvious hunger, and maintained the kind of gracious composure that spoke of careful upbringing. "Your parents raised you well," Theo observed. "They did their best," she replied quietly. "Mama always said that good manners cost nothing but mean everything." The simple wisdom of the statement, delivered without pretension, impressed him. Here was a child who had been taught values that went deeper than mere survival. As morning stretched toward afternoon, Theo found himself reluctant to address the practical questions that needed answering. Where would she sleep? What arrangements could be made? He was an unmarried man living alone. The social complications of taking in an orphaned girl would be significant. Yet the alternative, sending her back out into an uncertain world, seemed unthinkable. The answer came from Fiona herself. "Mr. Theo," she said as she finished cleaning the breakfast dishes, "I know it ain't proper for me to stay in the house. If you got a barn or a shed with a roof that don't leak, I can make do. I don't need much, just a dry place to lay my head and the chance to earn my keep." Her matter-of-fact approach to her circumstances both impressed and saddened him. No child should have to think in such practical terms about their basic needs. "There's a small cabin out back," he said slowly. "My foreman used to live there before he got married and moved to town. It's got a stove and a bed. Needs some fixing up, but it's sound." Hope flickered in her eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "I could keep house for you, do the cooking, tend a garden if you'll have one. I work hard, and I don't eat much." Theo looked at this serious child who spoke like a woman twice her age and made a decision that would change both their lives. "Fiona Peterson," he said formally, "I believe we can come to an arrangement that suits us both." And for the first time in 7 years, Theodore Blackwood's house felt like a home again. 3 weeks had passed since Fiona's arrival at the Blackwood Ranch, and a comfortable routine had settled over the property like morning dew. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent her days maintaining the house and tending a small garden she had started behind the cabin, and concluded each evening by preparing supper that consistently impressed Theo with its quality and care. The small cabin had indeed needed work, but Theo had seen to the repairs personally, new chinking between the logs, a proper door that latched securely, and windows that opened to let in the spring air. Fiona had transformed the simple space into something approaching cozy, with wildflowers in a mason jar on the rough-hewn table and her few possessions arranged with care. On this particular Thursday morning, the sound of approaching hooves interrupted their usual breakfast quiet. Theo looked up from his eggs to see young Billy Hutchins from town riding up the path at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual business. "Morning." "Mr. Blackwood," Billy called as he reined in his horse near the porch. "Got mail for you from town. Some of it looks important." Theo accepted the bundle of letters, noting that most bore the usual markings of business correspondence, cattle buyers, bank statements, and other ranch-related matters. But one envelope, cream-colored and bearing an elegant feminine script, made his hands still completely. The return address read, I. Blackwood, San Francisco, California. Isabel. His daughter Fiona, who had been clearing the breakfast dishes, noticed the change in Theo's demeanor immediately. His face had gone pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he held the letter. Everything all right, Mr. Theo? She asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the envelope as if it might burst into flames. Billy, sensing the tension, made his excuses and rode back toward town, leaving them alone with the weight of whatever news the letter contained. Theo rose abruptly from the table, the letter still unopened in his hands. I'll be in the barn, he said, his voice strained. Fiona watched him walk away with measured steps that seemed to require great effort. She had never seen him so affected by anything, not even when a late spring blizzard had claimed several head of cattle the previous week. This was something deeper, something that reached into the very core of the man who had become her protector. She finished her kitchen tasks, but her mind remained focused on Theo's distress. After an hour had passed without his return, she ventured to the barn, carrying a cup of coffee she had kept warm on the stove. She found him sitting on a hay bale, the unopened letter resting on his knee. His face bore an expression of such profound sorrow that it took her breath away. Mr. Theo, she said softly, I brought you coffee. He looked up as if surprised to find he was not alone. Thank you, child. That's kind of you. She set the cup beside him on another bale, and then, after a moment's hesitation, sat down nearby. They remained in comfortable silence for several minutes, surrounded by the familiar sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and sparrows nesting in the rafters. It's from my daughter, Theo finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I haven't heard from her in nearly 7 years. Fiona absorbed this information quietly. In their weeks together, Theo had mentioned very little about his past, beyond the basic facts of his wife's death. The existence of a daughter was news to her, and the obvious pain it caused him suggested a story far more complicated than simple loss. She lives in San Francisco, he continued, still staring at the letter. Left right after her mother died. Blame me for what happened. The weight of those few words carried volumes of pain. Fiona, despite her youth, understood something about loss and blame. She had spent weeks after her parents' death wondering if there was something she could have done differently. Some way she might have saved them from the fever that claimed them both. Sometimes people say things when they're hurting, she said carefully. Things they might not mean forever. Theo's laugh held no humor. She meant it, and she was right to mean it. Fiona waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. Margaret, my wife, she had a difficult pregnancy. The doctor said there might be complications, recommended she go to a bigger town, maybe even Denver, where there were better physicians. But I was so sure everything would be fine. This was our land, our home. I thought we could handle anything here. His hands clenched involuntarily as the memories surfaced. When her time came, it went wrong quickly, too quickly. By the time I realized we needed help, it was too late to get her anywhere else. She died in our bed, and the baby, Isabel, nearly died too. If Doc Morrison hadn't been visiting the Henderson place that night, I would have lost them both. Fiona felt tears sting her eyes at the pain in his voice. Isabel blamed me for keeping Margaret here, for not listening to the doctor's warnings. She was 18 then, old enough to make her own choices. The day after we buried her mother, she packed her things and left for California. Said she never wanted to see me or this place again. The silence that followed was heavy with grief that had aged like wine, growing more potent with time rather than fading. Maybe she's writing because that's changed, Fiona suggested gently. Theo shook his head. More likely she needs something. Money, probably. I've been sending her funds through the bank in San Francisco for years, but she's never acknowledged them, never written. Until now. He picked up the letter, turning it over in his hands as if the weight of it might give him some clue to its contents. Aren't you going to open it? Fiona asked. I'm afraid to, he admitted, the words coming out as if torn from somewhere deep inside. What if she's sick? What if she's in trouble? What if? He paused, and when he continued, his voice was barely audible. What if she still hates me? Fiona understood then that this letter represented far more than simple communication. It was a door that had been closed for 7 years, and opening it meant facing whatever lay beyond, reconciliation or final rejection, hope or devastation. Mr. Theo, she said carefully, I ain't got much experience with family matters, seeing as how mine's gone. But it seems to me that not knowing is harder than knowing, even if the knowing hurts. He looked at her with surprise, as if he had forgotten how young she was. In their daily interactions, her maturity and practical wisdom made it easy to think of her as older than her years. When did you get so wise, Fiona Peterson? He asked. Mama used to say that wisdom comes from paying attention to what hurts and what heals, she replied. Pain's gonna be there either way, but maybe healing's got a chance if you open the door for it. Theo studied the girl who had brought such unexpected peace to his life. In just 3 weeks, she had reminded him what it felt like to care for someone, to have someone depend on him in the simple, daily ways that make a life meaningful. The irony was not lost on him. He had failed his own daughter. But perhaps he could do better by this orphaned child who asked for nothing more than a place to belong. With hands that still trembled slightly, he opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. His eyes moved across the elegant script, and Fiona watched his expression change from fear to surprise to something that might have been hope. She's coming home, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. She says she needs to talk to me about something important. She'll be here next week. Fiona felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. Joy for Theo, who so clearly needed this reconciliation with his daughter. But also fear. What would happen to her when Isabel arrived? Would there be room in this family reunion for an orphaned girl who had no claim on the name Blackwood? That's wonderful, Mr. Theo, she said, and meant it despite her fears. He looked at her sharply, as if reading her thoughts. Fiona, I want you to understand something. Whatever happens with Isabel, whatever she needs to discuss, it doesn't change anything between us. You have a home here for as long as you want it. His words should have been comforting, but Fiona had learned not to count on promises from adults, no matter how well-intentioned. People's circumstances changed. Loyalties shifted. She had seen it happen to other orphaned children. Welcomed into homes until the family's situation changed, then passed along to the next temporary arrangement. Of course, Mr. Theo, she said quietly. I understand. But as she walked back to the house to begin preparing lunch, she found herself planning differently than she had in weeks. Instead of thinking about the garden she wanted to expand, or the improvements she hoped to make to the cabin, she found herself taking inventory of her few possessions, mentally preparing for the possibility that her time at the Blackwood Ranch might be coming to an end. The letter had changed everything, just as she had known it would the moment she saw the pain in Theo's eyes. In 7 days, Isabel Blackwood would return home, and Fiona would discover whether the family she had begun to hope for had room for one more, or whether she would once again find herself walking down a dusty road with everything she owned in a flour sack. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind whisper through the prairie grass, Fiona Peterson allowed herself one last night of pretending that she truly belonged somewhere. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for whatever changes Isabel's return might bring. The days following the letter's arrival took on a different quality, as if the very air around the ranch had become charged with anticipation. Fiona threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, rising even earlier to ensure that every corner of the house gleamed and every meal exceeded the already high standards she had set for herself. She had developed a routine that served them both well. Before dawn, while Theo was still checking on the cattle, she would start the coffee and begin breakfast preparations. By the time he returned to the house, the aroma of fresh biscuits and bacon would greet him at the door. After breakfast, while he attended to ranch business, she would clean the house thoroughly, tend her growing garden, and begin preparations for the midday meal. It was during one of these morning routines, as she worked her mother's cast-iron skillet over the stove, that Doc Morrison made his first visit since her arrival. The kindly physician, a man in his 60s with gentle eyes and silver hair, had served the scattered ranching community for more than 30 years. His arrival was always welcome, as he brought news from town and a warm, grandfatherly presence that put everyone at ease. "Well now," Doc Morrison said, as he accepted a cup of coffee from Fiona. "This is the young lady I've been hearing so much about. The whole town's talking about Theo Blackwood's mysterious houseguest." Fiona felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She had hoped to remain unnoticed by the broader community, but apparently her presence had become a topic of conversation. "Now don't you worry, child," Doc Morrison continued, noting her discomfort. "It's mostly good talk. Folks are saying Theo looks better than he has in years, and that's no small thing. This old ranch needed some life in it again." When Theo joined them at the table, Doc Morrison's examination of him was as much social as medical. The two men had been friends for decades, and the doctor's trained eye could see changes that went beyond the physical. "You're sleeping better," Doc observed, "and you've put on some weight. Good weight, not the soft kind that comes from too much whiskey and not enough purpose." Theo glanced at Fiona, who was quietly cleaning dishes while listening to their conversation. "Having decent meals helps," he said simply. "I imagine it does. But it's more than that, isn't it?" Doc Morrison's voice carried the gentle persistence of someone who had spent years drawing truth from reluctant patients. "You've got something to care about again." The conversation was interrupted by Fiona's sharp intake of breath. Both men turned to see her gripping the edge of the wash basin, her face pale and distant. "Child, what is it?" Doc Morrison was on his feet immediately, his medical instincts taking over. Fiona shook her head, as if clearing cobwebs. "I'm sorry. Sometimes I have dreams about the night my parents died. Sometimes they come back during the day, too." Doc Morrison exchanged a knowing look with Theo. He had seen this before in people who had experienced sudden, traumatic loss. The mind's way of trying to process what couldn't be understood. "Tell me about these dreams," he said gently. Guiding her to sit down, Fiona hesitated, but something in the doctor's manner invited confidence. "It's always the same. I'm trying to get to their room, but the door keeps moving farther away. I can hear them calling for me, asking for water, asking for help, but I can't reach them. Then I wake up, and I remember that I did bring them water. I did try to help, but it wasn't enough." The guilt in her voice was unmistakable. Doc Morrison had seen this too. Survivors carrying responsibility that wasn't theirs to bear. "Fiona," he said carefully, "how long were your parents sick before they passed?" "Near 3 weeks. The fever came on slow at first, then fast at the end. And you cared for them the whole time? No other family to help?" She nodded. "Just me. I did everything I could think of. Cool cloths for the fever, broth when they could keep it down, reading to them when they were restless. But nothing helped." Doc Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Child, I've been doctoring for more years than you've been alive, and I can tell you something with certainty. What killed your parents wasn't something you could have prevented or cured. The winter fever that came through this country took strong men and healthy women without regard for the care they received. The fact that you were there with them, that they weren't alone, that was the greatest gift you could have given them." Tears gathered in Fiona's eyes, though she tried to blink them away. "But maybe if I'd known more, if I'd done something different." "No," Doc Morrison said firmly. "Some things are beyond our power to change, no matter how much we wish otherwise. What matters is that you tried, that you stayed, that you loved them enough to fight for them, even when the fight was hopeless." Theo watched this exchange with a growing ache in his chest. Here was a child who had carried impossible guilt for months, just as he had carried his own guilt for 7 years. The parallel was too clear to ignore. After Doc Morrison left, promising to check on them both again soon, Theo found Fiona in the garden behind her cabin. She was weeding around the tomato plants she had started, working with the focused intensity she always brought to physical tasks. "Doc Morrison's right, you know," he said, settling on a nearby stump. "Some things can't be fixed, no matter how much we want to fix them." Fiona continued weeding, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. I know you blame yourself, he continued. I can see it in how hard you work, how you try to earn your place here. But child, you don't need to earn anything. You belong here because I want you here, not because you've somehow paid for the privilege. She sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. Do I belong here, I mean? Even when your daughter comes home? The question hung between them like a bridge that needed crossing. Theo realized that his reassurances the day of the letter hadn't been enough to quiet her fears. Fiona, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. In the weeks you've been here, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Not just good meals or a clean house, though those things matter. You've reminded me what it feels like to have someone to care for, someone who depends on me in the simple daily ways that make life meaningful. He paused, choosing his words carefully. When Margaret died, I thought that part of my life was over. When Isabel left, I was sure of it. I convinced myself that I was better off alone, that I couldn't be trusted with anyone else's well-being. But you've shown me that wasn't true. You've shown me that I can still be useful to someone, that I can still protect and provide and maybe even be a source of comfort. Fiona's eyes had grown wide as he spoke. So when I say you belong here, I don't mean as a hired girl or as someone earning her keep. I mean as family. The kind of family that chooses each other, that builds bonds stronger than blood, because they're forged in care and respect and genuine affection. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they did her. He hadn't planned this conversation, hadn't realized the depth of his feelings until he heard them spoken aloud. Even if Miss Isabel doesn't want me here, Fiona asked quietly. Especially then, Theo said firmly. Because this is my home and I decide who belongs in it. Isabel is my daughter and I love her, but she's been gone for 7 years. You're here now, and you're part of this family whether she understands that or not. For the first time since the letter arrived, Fiona smiled. Not the careful, grateful smile she usually offered, but a genuine expression of relief and joy. Thank you, Mr. Theo, she said. That means more than you know. That evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, both of them felt something had shifted between them. The bond that had been growing quietly for weeks had been acknowledged and claimed, creating a foundation strong enough to weather whatever storms Isabel's return might bring. Spring deepened into early summer, bringing with it a transformation of both the land and the people who worked it. The prairie grass grew thick and green. Wildflowers painted the rolling hills in brilliant colors, and Fiona's garden flourished under her careful tending. She had expanded beyond the basic vegetables, adding herbs and flowers that she pressed between the pages of an old book she had found in Theo's study. The pressed wildflowers had become a quiet passion of hers. Each evening after supper, she would venture into the meadows surrounding the ranch house, collecting specimens that caught her eye. Delicate bluebells, bright Indian paintbrush, the tiny white stars of chickweed. Back in her cabin, she would carefully arrange them between sheets of paper, weighing them down with heavy books until they dried into perfect memories of Montana's brief but glorious growing season. It was this hobby that brought her first real recognition beyond the ranch. When cattle buyers from Denver arrived to negotiate with Theo for his spring herd, they stayed for dinner, as was customary. Fiona had prepared a feast that showcased both her culinary skills and the abundance of her garden. Roast beef with new potatoes, fresh bread with butter churned that morning, and a rhubarb pie that drew actual sighs of appreciation from the hardened businessman. "Blackwood," said James Hartwell, the lead buyer, as he finished his second slice of pie. "I don't know where you found this young lady, but you'd better make sure she never leaves. I've eaten in the finest restaurants from Chicago to San Francisco, and this meal rivals anything I've ever tasted." Theo felt a surge of pride that caught him off guard. "Fiona's got a gift, that's certain." "More than a gift," added Hartwell's partner, Samuel Cross. "This is artistry. The way she's combined flavors, the presentation, even these pressed flowers she's used to decorate the table. It shows a refinement you don't often see on the frontier." Fiona, who had been quietly serving and clearing dishes, flushed at the praise. She had indeed used some of her pressed flowers to create small arrangements on the table, thinking they might add a touch of elegance to the important business dinner. The cattle buyers were so impressed that they extended their stay an extra day, allowing Fiona to prepare breakfast and lunch as well. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and by the time they left, they had spread word throughout their network about the exceptional hospitality at the Blackwood Ranch. This recognition, while gratifying, also brought unwanted attention. Within a week of the buyer's departure, Martha Kellins arrived for what she called a social visit. Martha was the self-appointed moral guardian of their small community, a woman whose comfortable circumstances and sharp tongue made her. "Opinions carry weight throughout the territory, Theodore Blackwood," she announced, as she settled herself in the main room like a general preparing for battle. "We need to discuss this situation you've created." Theo, who had been enjoying a peaceful afternoon reading while Fiona tended her garden, set down his book with resignation. He had been expecting this visit, though he had hoped it might be delayed longer. "What situation would that be, Martha? Don't play innocent with me. You have an unmarried girl living on your property, cooking your meals, keeping your house. The talk in town is becoming quite unseemly." "The talk in town," Theo replied evenly, "is none of my concern. Fiona is a child who needed help, and I was in a position to provide it." Martha sniffed disapprovingly. "She's not exactly a child, Theodore. She's what, 12, 13? Old enough for people to notice that this arrangement is highly irregular. An unmarried man of your age taking in a young girl, no matter how pure your intentions, creates the appearance of impropriety." Theo felt his temper beginning to rise, but he kept his voice level. "My intentions are entirely proper, and anyone who knows me would never question that." "I don't question your intentions," Martha replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But appearance matters in a community like ours. People talk, they wonder, and eventually that talk reaches the ears of officials who might decide to investigate." The threat was subtle but clear. Martha was not just expressing social disapproval. She was hinting at legal consequences. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Theo asked. "The proper thing would be to place the girl in an appropriate institution. There's an excellent orphanage in Helena that would—" "No." Theo's voice carried a finality that made Martha blink in surprise. "Theodore, be reasonable. I understand you've grown fond of the girl, but, Martha, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Fiona Peterson is under my protection, and she will remain under my protection as long as she chooses to stay here. Any attempt to interfere with that arrangement will be met with every legal and financial resource at my disposal." Martha's eyes widened. She had not expected such fierce resistance. "Theodore, you're not thinking clearly. Your grief over Margaret, your loneliness, it's clouding your judgment. This girl has filled a void in your life, but that doesn't make this situation appropriate." "You're right about one thing," Theo said, standing to indicate the conversation was over. "Fiona has filled a void in my life. She's reminded me what it means to have family, what it means to care for someone and be cared for in return. That's not something I'm willing to give up because of what people might think." After Martha left, clearly frustrated by her inability to sway him, Theo found Fiona in the kitchen preparing supper. Her movements were more subdued than usual, and he realized she had overheard at least part of the conversation. "How much did you hear?" he asked gently. "Enough," she replied without looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "She's not wrong about how it looks, Mr. Theo. People will talk. Let them talk. But what if she's right about the officials? What if someone comes to take me away?" Theo moved to stand beside her at the work table. "Fiona, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, and he saw the fear there, not just of being taken away, but of causing trouble for the man who had become her protector. "No one is going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. I have influence in this territory, more than Martha Kellins realizes. I can make legal arrangements that will protect you, protect us both." "What kind of arrangements?" Theo hesitated. He had been thinking about this possibility since Doc Morrison's visit, but saying it aloud would make it real in a way that might change everything between them. I could adopt you legally, make you my daughter in the eyes of the law as well as in my heart. The knife slipped from Fiona's hands, clattering on the wooden cutting board. She stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. You'd do that? Really? If you'd want me to? If you'd want to be Fiona Blackwood instead of Fiona Peterson? Tears gathered in her eyes, but for the first time since he'd known her. They seemed to be tears of joy rather than sorrow. I'd like that very much, she whispered. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over their land, for it truly felt like their land now, both of them felt the truth of what had been acknowledged. They were no longer just a lonely man and an orphaned girl who had found each other by chance. They were family, chosen and claimed, bound by something deeper than blood or circumstance. The pressed wildflowers in Fiona's collection had captured the beauty of moments that would otherwise fade. In much the same way, their decision to make their bond official would preserve the love that had grown between them, protecting it from the winds of change that Isabel's return might bring. The morning that would change everything arrived with deceptive tranquility. Fiona was in her garden, harvesting vegetables for the midday meal, when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Looking up, she saw 3 riders coming up the path, strangers, by the look of them, dressed in the practical clothing of people who had traveled hard and fast. Theo emerged from the barn where he had been checking on a mare about to foal, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept nearby. Visitors were rare enough that unannounced arrivals warranted caution. The lead rider, a thin man with sharp features and calculating eyes, dismounted near the porch. His companions, a woman of middle years and a younger man who bore a family resemblance to the leader, remained mounted in positions that suggested they were prepared for a quick departure if necessary. You Theodore Blackwood? The thin man asked without preamble. I am. And you are? Name's Jeremiah Holt. This is my wife Catherine and my son David. We're here about the Peterson girl. Fiona's blood ran cold. These were her father's relatives, distant cousins she had met only a handful of times at family gatherings. She remembered Jeremiah as a man who always seemed to be calculating the value of everything around him, including people. Theo's expression hardened. What about her? Well, she's family, ain't she? Bloodkin. We've come to take her home where she belongs. This is her home, Theo replied evenly. Jeremiah's laugh held no warmth. Now, Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate you taking the girl in when she was in need, but she's got proper family to care for her now. We've got a nice farm up north, plenty of room, and Catherine here could use help with the household duties. Fiona understood immediately what kind of help they had in mind. She would become unpaid labor, a servant in all but name, working to earn her keep in a household that saw her as an obligation rather than a blessing. Fiona's situation is already settled, Theo said. She has a home here for as long as she wants it. That's generous of you, Catherine Holt spoke for the first time, her voice carrying full sweetness, but it's not proper for an unmarried man to be raising a young girl. People talk about such arrangements, and we wouldn't want Fiona's reputation to suffer. The same argument Martha Kellins had made. But coming from these people it felt different, more calculating, less concerned with propriety than with opportunity. Besides, Jeremiah added, there's the matter of inheritance. Fiona's parents had some property, few head of cattle. As her guardians, we'd see that she gets what's rightfully hers when she comes of age. Theo's broken pocket watch seemed to grow heavier in his vest pocket. Time had stopped for him once before, when he'd failed to protect someone he loved. He would not let it stop again. I'm afraid you've made this trip for nothing, he said firmly. Fiona is legally under my protection now. I've filed papers with the territorial court to adopt her as my daughter. This was not entirely true. He'd only begun the process, but the lie served its purpose. Jeremiah's confident expression faltered. Now see here, that can't be legal. We're blood relatives. We have first claim. The law doesn't recognize first claim when it comes to the welfare of orphaned children, Theo replied. The court's only concern is what's in the child's best interest. And any judge can see that Fiona is thriving here. During this exchange, Fiona had remained frozen by her garden, clutching a basket of tomatoes like a shield. The conversation was about her future, her life, but she felt powerless to influence its outcome. She was property to be negotiated over, not a person with wishes of her own. What does the girl want? David Holt spoke for the first time, his voice younger and less calculating than his father's. Seems to me she ought to have a say in where she lives. Jeremiah shot his son a sharp look, clearly displeased with this injection of the girl's own preferences into the discussion. Of course, she has a say, Theo replied, though he felt nervous about putting such pressure on Fiona. Fiona, would you come here, please? She approached slowly, her steps measured and careful. When she reached the porch, Theo placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture of support that did not go unnoticed by their unwanted visitors. These folks say they're your family, Theo said gently. They want you to come live with them. What would you like to do? Fiona looked at the three Holts, taking in their travel-worn clothes, their calculating expressions, and the way they looked at her as if she were livestock being evaluated for purchase. Then she looked at Theo, seeing the worry in his eyes and the protective stance of his body. I'd like to stay here, she said quietly but clearly. This is my home now. Jeremiah's face flushed with anger. Girl, you don't understand what you're saying. We're offering you a real family, people who share your blood. This man is a stranger who's taken advantage of your situation. Mr. Theo has never taken advantage of me, Fiona replied, finding strength in her voice. He's given me a home, treated me with kindness, and asked for nothing in return but honest work. That's more than I can say for blood relatives who only showed interest in me after learning I might have property to inherit. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Catherine Holt sputtered in indignation, but Jeremiah's expression turned ugly. You ungrateful little... That's enough. Theo stepped forward, placing himself between Fiona and her hostile relatives. You have your answer. The girl chooses to stay here, and I choose to keep her. Unless you have legal documentation giving you guardianship rights, I suggest you start back toward wherever you came from. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. This isn't over, Blackwood. We'll be back with the proper authorities. A judge will see reason even if you won't. You're welcome to try, Theo replied calmly. But I think you'll find that judges tend to favor stable, loving homes over opportunistic relatives who show up only when there might be property involved. The Holts departed with threats and bitter words, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension that took hours to dissipate. That evening, as Fiona prepared supper with hands that still trembled slightly from the day's stress, she felt the full weight of how precarious her situation truly was. They'll be back, she said quietly, as she served Theo his plate. Let them come, he replied. We'll be ready. But what if they're right? What if a judge decides blood family is more important than chosen family? Theo reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Fiona, I made you a promise and I intend to keep it. You belong here with me for as long as you want to stay. Whatever legal battles we have to fight, we'll fight them together. His broken pocket watch ticked silently in his vest, marking moments that felt suspended between threat and security, between family found and family that might be lost again. But as he looked at the girl who had brought such unexpected joy to his life, Theodore Blackwood knew he would fight any battle necessary to protect the home they had built together. The Holt's visit had reminded them both how fragile their happiness was, but it had also strengthened their resolve. They were no longer just two people who had found each other by chance. They were a family worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth any sacrifice that might be required to keep them together. In the weeks following the Holt's unwelcome visit, life at the ranch took on a new urgency. Theo threw himself into the legal process of adoption with the same determination he had once applied to building his cattle empire. He made frequent trips to town, consulting with lawyers and filing the necessary paperwork that would make Fiona legally his daughter. But it was during the quiet evening hours that their bond deepened most profoundly. After supper, When the day's work was done, Theo began teaching Fiona skills that went beyond cooking and housekeeping. He showed her the ranch's account books, explaining how to track expenses and profits, how to negotiate with buyers, and how to manage the complex web of relationships that kept a large operation running smoothly. "A woman needs to understand business," he told her one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, ledgers spread between them, "especially a woman who might someday inherit property of her own." Fiona looked up from the column of figures she was carefully copying. "Do you really think the court will let you adopt me?" "I do," Theo replied, though privately he harbored concerns about the Holt's threat to return with legal support. "But even if something goes wrong, I want you to be prepared for whatever life brings. Knowledge is the one thing no one can take away from you." As part of this education, he had been teaching her to read more advanced texts than the simple newspapers and almanacs she had mastered. To his surprise, she showed a particular aptitude for literature, devouring books from his modest library with an enthusiasm that reminded him painfully of Margaret, who had been a voracious reader. It was during one of these evening lessons that Fiona discovered his shameful secret, a discovery that came about through her innocent attempt to help him with correspondence. "Mr. Theo," she said carefully as he struggled to compose, "a letter to his lawyer. Would you like me to write that for you? My handwriting is neater, and I could make sure all the words are spelled proper." He looked up from the paper, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I can manage," but Fiona had noticed his difficulties before. The way he held books too close to his eyes, how he sometimes asked her to read documents aloud to save his aging eyes, the careful way he formed letters when he had to write anything. The truth dawned on her with startling clarity. "You can't read well, can you?" she asked gently. The question hung between them, like a bridge that could either bring them closer together or create an unbridgeable gap. Theo's first instinct was denial, but something in Fiona's expression, understanding rather than judgment, made him reconsider. "Not well, no," he admitted finally. "I can make out simple things, but anything complicated—" He trailed off, unable to finish the admission of what he saw as his greatest failing. "How did you manage the ranch business all these years?" "Margaret handled most of the paperwork when she was alive. After she died, I relied on others. My foreman, the banker in town, Doc Morrison when needed. I've gotten by, but it's always been a struggle." Fiona absorbed this information without the shock or pity he had expected. Instead, she seemed thoughtful. "Would you like me to teach you?" she asked. "The same way you've been teaching me about the business." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Theo felt tears prick at his eyes. Here was this child, offering to share her knowledge with the same patient kindness he had shown her. "You wouldn't mind?" "Mind, Mr. Theo, you've given me everything, a home, a family, a future. Teaching you to read better would be a privilege, not a burden." And so their evening routine expanded to include reading lessons that flowed in both directions. Theo continued teaching Fiona about ranch management and business practices, while she patiently helped him sound out difficult words and understand complex sentences. It was during these sessions that their relationship evolved from guardian and ward to something more like true partners in building a life together. The hand-carved wooden spoon that became central to this chapter emerged from these quiet evenings. Theo had always been handy with wood, a skill learned from his father, but he rarely found time for such pursuits. Watching Fiona work in the kitchen night after night, he noticed that she had only basic utensils to work with, including her mother's precious cast-iron skillet, but no proper wooden spoons for stirring and tasting. One evening, while she helped him read through a complex contract, he began whittling a piece of seasoned maple. His hands worked almost unconsciously, shaping the wood, while his mind focused on the difficult text before him. "What are you making?" Fiona asked during a break in their lesson. "A spoon," he replied, holding up the emerging tool. "For your cooking. I noticed you're always making do with whatever's handy. But a good cook deserves proper tools." The simple gift represented something profound, his recognition of her skills, his investment in her future. and his desire to contribute something meaningful to the craft that gave her such joy. When he presented the finished spoon to her several days later, sanded smooth and rubbed with oil until it gleamed like honey, Fiona's reaction surprised him with its intensity. "It's beautiful," she whispered, turning the spoon over in her hands. "No one's ever made anything special just for me before." "Well, you're a special young lady who deserves special things," Theo replied, but privately he was moved by her gratitude. Such a simple gift. Yet to her it represented being seen, being valued, being worth the time and effort it had taken to create. The spoon quickly became her favorite tool, perfect for stirring sauces and tasting soups. But more than its practical value, it served as a daily reminder that she was cared for by someone who paid attention to her needs and took pride in her accomplishments. As summer deepened, their routine of shared learning and growing trust created an atmosphere of peace that seemed almost too good to be true. Fiona's skills in the kitchen continued to develop, aided by the steady stream of compliments from ranch hands and visitors who marveled at her abilities. Her reading improved as well, and she began helping Theo with more complex business correspondence. But beneath this growing contentment lay the persistent worry about Isabel's impending return. The letter had said, "next week," but that had been over a month ago. Each day brought the possibility that she might arrive, and with her, questions about where an orphaned girl would fit in a reunion between father and daughter. "Do you think she's changed her mind about coming?" Fiona asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Maybe," Theo replied, though he privately doubted it. Isabel had never been one to make idle threats or empty promises. If she said she was coming, she would come eventually. "Are you nervous about seeing her again?" Theo considered the question carefully. Nervous, yes, but also hopeful. 7 years is a long time to carry anger and hurt. Maybe we've both changed enough that we can find our way back to each other. And if you do find your way back to each other, where does that leave me? The question he had been dreading, spoken with the direct honesty that made Fiona such an extraordinary child. Theo turned to look at her, seeing the careful control she exercised over her features, the way she held herself ready for disappointment, even as she hoped for reassurance. "It leaves you right here, where you belong," he said firmly. "Fiona, I need you to understand something. My love for Isabel, assuming we can rebuild that relationship, doesn't diminish my love for you. The heart doesn't work like a pie that gets smaller when you cut more pieces. Love multiplies, it doesn't divide." She nodded, but he could see the doubt that lingered in her eyes. Words were easy. Reality would be the test. That night, as Fiona lay in her narrow bed holding the wooden spoon Theo had carved for her, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she truly belonged somewhere permanently, where she wasn't just a temporary guest in someone else's life, but a permanent part of a family that chose to keep her not out of duty or pity, but out of genuine love. It was a fragile dream, she knew, dependent on the goodwill of people who had the power to change their minds. But as she drifted off to sleep, the smooth wood of the spoon warm in her palm, Fiona Peterson allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, some dreams were strong enough to survive whatever storms might come. The morning Isabel Blackwood arrived. The sky hung heavy with the promise of summer storms. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Fiona hung laundry behind the main house, stealing glances at the horizon where dark clouds gathered like an omen. She had been on edge for days, sensing that something was about to change. Though she couldn't have explained how, she knew. Theo was in the barn, helping one of the ranch hands shoe a horse, when the sound of wheels on gravel announced an approaching buggy. Fiona dropped the shirt she was hanging and moved to where she could see the main drive, her heart hammering against her ribs. The buggy was finer than any that usually visited the ranch, polished black wood with brass fittings that gleamed despite the overcast sky. The driver was a professional, dressed in the kind of formal clothing that spoke of city wages. But it was the passenger that made Fiona's breath catch in her throat. Isabel Blackwood stepped down from the buggy with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being noticed. She was perhaps 25 now, tall and elegant in a way that spoke of comfortable living and careful attention to appearance. Her traveling dress was a deep blue silk that probably cost more than most families spent on clothing in a year, and her dark hair was arranged in a sophisticated style that had clearly been done by a professional. But it was her face that arrested Fiona's attention. Even from a distance, she could see the strong resemblance to Theo, the same determined jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same way of holding herself that suggested inner strength. Yet where Theo's expression had grown gentle over their months together, Isabel's face bore the sharp edges of someone who had learned not to show vulnerability. Fiona remained frozen by the laundry line as Theo emerged from the barn, his face cycling through emotions too complex to follow. Joy, fear, hope and pain all flickered across his features as he approached his daughter, Isabel. His voice carried across the yard, hoarse with feeling. "Father!" Her response was cooler, more controlled, though Fiona caught a slight tremor that suggested Isabel was not as composed as she appeared. They stood facing each other for a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. Two people separated by years of hurt and misunderstanding. Finally, Theo stepped forward and, somewhat awkwardly, embraced his daughter. She allowed the contact but did not return it, her body remaining stiff and unyielding. "You look well," Theo said as they separated. "City life agrees with you, does it?" Isabel's laugh held little humor. "I suppose it must, since I've had little choice in the matter." The words carried an edge that made Fiona wince. This was not the happy reunion Theo had hoped for, she realized. There were still wounds here that had not healed, grievances that had not been forgiven. It was then that Isabel noticed Fiona standing by the laundry line, and her expression hardened further. "And who might this be?" she asked, though her tone suggested she had already drawn her own conclusions. Theo turned toward Fiona, his face creased with worry. "Isabel, I'd like you to meet Fiona. She's been living here since early spring." "Living here." Isabel repeated the words as if they tasted bitter. "How convenient." Fiona found the courage to approach, though every instinct told her to flee. "Miss Isabel," she said quietly, offering a small curtsy her mother had taught her years ago. "I'm pleased to meet you." Isabel studied her with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a potential threat. Fiona found herself being assessed from her simple cotton dress to her work-roughened hands, and she could see the moment when Isabel categorized her as a servant, or, worse, something more calculating. "How old are you, child?" 12, ma'am." "Nearly 13. Nearly 13. Isabel's voice grew colder. "How interesting. Tell me, Father, how exactly did this arrangement come about?" The question was loaded with implications that made Theo's jaw tighten. "Fiona was orphaned by the winter fever. She came here seeking work, and I gave her a home. Work." Isabel's eyes never left Fiona's face. "What sort of work does a 12-year-old girl do for an unmarried man?" The insinuation hit like a physical blow. Fiona felt her cheeks burn with shame at the suggestion behind Isabel's words, while Theo's face went white with anger. "That's enough," he said sharply. "Fiona is under my protection, and I won't have you or anyone else suggesting impropriety where none exists." "Your protection." Isabel turned her cold gaze to her father. "How noble of you. And I suppose this protection extends to giving her free room and board, clothing, perhaps even an education." "It does. How generous. And what does this protected child give you in return?" Theo's hands clenched into fists. "She gives me the pleasure of her company and the satisfaction of knowing I'm doing right by a child in need." The pleasure of her company. Isabel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. How touching. "Father, do you have any idea how this looks to an outsider? A wealthy widower, living alone for years, suddenly taking in a pretty young girl who just happens to appear on his doorstep." "Isabel." Theo's voice cracked like a whip. "You will not speak of Fiona in that manner. I'm merely pointing out what others will certainly notice. What I noticed immediately upon arriving." Isabel's composure never wavered, though Fiona could see the pain behind her calculated cruelty. "This girl has taken my mother's place in your house, father. She cooks your meals, tends your home, provides you with companionship. It's a rather convenient arrangement, don't you think?" The truth hit Fiona like a physical blow. She had indeed taken Margaret Blackwood's place in many ways, filling the domestic void left by Theo's wife's death. In her innocence, she had seen it as earning her keep through honest work. But through Isabel's eyes, it looked like something far more calculated and disturbing. "Fiona is my daughter in everything but law," Theo said firmly. "I'm in the process of adopting her legally, your daughter." Isabel's laugh was sharp and bitter. "How convenient that you should find a replacement daughter just in time for your real daughter's return. Tell me, father, did you love her more easily because she doesn't carry the burden of our family's history? Because she doesn't remind you daily of your failures?" The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Theo reeled as if he'd been physically struck, his face going ashen. "That's not," he began, but Isabel cut him off. "Isn't it? You gave up on me years ago, decided I was too difficult, too damaged by what happened to Mother. But this sweet little orphan appears, grateful for any scraps of affection you throw her way, and suddenly you remember how to be a father." Fiona felt tears burning her eyes as the terrible truth of Isabel's words settled over her. She had been a replacement, a substitute for the daughter Theo had lost. All their quiet moments together, all the care he had shown her, had it all been simply his way of practicing for the real thing? "Isabel, please," Theo's voice broke. "This isn't about replacing anyone. I love you both, love us both." Isabel's composure finally cracked, revealing the raw pain beneath. "You can't love us both, father. You failed me when I needed you most. You chose your guilt and grief over your own daughter. And now you want to assuage that guilt by saving this little waif who reminds you of what you should have done for me." The train ticket that would become the chapter's central artifact appeared at that moment. Pulled from Isabel's reticule with trembling fingers. "I have a return ticket to San Francisco," she said, her voice steadying again, though her hands shook. "I came here to give you one last chance to choose your real family over whatever fantasy you've constructed with this girl. But I can see where your loyalties lie." "Isabel, wait." Theo stepped forward, but she held up a hand to stop him. "No, father. I've waited long enough. 7 years I've waited for you to come after me, to fight for me, to show me that I mattered more than your precious ranch and your comfortable solitude. But you never did. And now I find you've replaced me with someone more convenient, someone who doesn't challenge you or remind you of your failures." She turned to Fiona, her expression softening slightly as she took in the girl's obvious distress. "Child, I don't blame you for this situation. You were hungry and homeless, and you took what was offered. But you should know that you're living in my mother's shadow, filling a role that was never truly yours to fill." Fiona's world crumbled around her. Every moment of happiness she had found at the ranch, every sense of belonging she had dared to feel, suddenly seemed like a cruel illusion. She had been playing house in someone else's life, wearing clothes that didn't belong to her, sleeping in a bed meant for someone else's dreams. "I should go," she whispered, backing away from both of them. "Fiona, no." Theo reached for her, but she was already turning toward the cabin, toward the flour sack that still held her few true possessions. "Let her go," Isabel said coldly. "She's young. She'll recover from this disappointment and find a real home somewhere else. She has a real home here." Theo's voice rose to a shout that echoed across the ranch yard. "I won't let you destroy what we've built together just because you can't accept that I've found some measure of peace." "Peace?" Isabel whirled on him, her composure finally shattering completely. "You call this peace? You've hidden yourself away on this ranch for 7 years, refusing to face what you did, refusing to fight for your real family. And when a convenient substitute appears, you embrace her because she doesn't require you to confront your failures." "What I did?" Thea's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "What exactly did I do, Isabel? I kept your mother here when she wanted to stay. I honored her wishes to give birth in our home, surrounded by the land she loved. When things went wrong, I got the best help available as fast as I could. I held her while she died, and I held you when you nearly followed her. You could have insisted, Isabel shot back. You could have overruled her, taken her to Denver whether she wanted to go or not. You had the power to save her, and you chose not to use it. I chose to respect her autonomy, her right to make her own decisions about her body and her life. Maybe I was wrong, but I was trying to honor the woman I loved, not control her. For a moment the air between them crackled with 7 years of accumulated pain and recrimination. Then Isabel's shoulders sagged and some of the fight went out of her voice. I needed someone to blame, she said quietly. Losing her was so senseless, so unfair. I needed it to be someone's fault, and you were the easiest target. I know, Theo replied, his own voice gentling. I blame myself too. I still do some days, but not when you're playing father to that girl. Not replacement father, Theo said firmly. Just father. The way I should have learned to be for you. Isabel looked toward the cabin, where Fiona had disappeared. And for the first time, her expression showed something other than anger or calculation. She really means that much to you? She does. Not because she's easier to love than you were, but because she taught me that I still had love to give. That I wasn't broken beyond repair. And if I asked you to choose, if I said I'd only stay if she leaves. Theo was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the impossible choice his daughter had laid before him. Finally, he met her eyes with painful honesty. I'd choose you both, or neither of you. I won't abandon Fiona to win back your love, Isabel. That girl has been through enough loss. And I won't abandon you either, even if you can't see your way clear to sharing my affection with someone else. Isabel stared at him, processing this unexpected response. She had come prepared for him to choose the path of least resistance, to send the girl away, rather than risk losing his real daughter again. You've changed, she said finally. I had to. Staying the same wasn't working for either of us. The train ticket in Isabel's hand seemed to grow heavier as she considered her options. She had expected anger or guilt or desperate pleading. She had not expected this quiet strength, this refusal to be manipulated into abandoning someone he had committed to protect. I came here because I'm in trouble, she admitted suddenly, the words seeming to surprise her as much as they did him. Financial trouble. My husband left, took most of our savings with him. I've been struggling to maintain appearances, but I can't keep it up much longer. The revelation hung between them, like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Theo absorbed the information without judgment, though his face showed concern and perhaps relief that his daughter's return wasn't motivated entirely by spite. So you came home, he said simply. I came to ask for help, and to see if there was anything left between us worth salvaging. Her voice grew smaller, more vulnerable than it had been since her arrival. But I found her instead, and it felt like you'd already replaced me with someone who fit better into your new life. No one could replace you, Isabel. You're my daughter, my blood, my first child. But that doesn't mean my heart doesn't have room for another daughter too. The storm that had been threatening finally broke, sending the first fat drops of rain splattering into the dust around them. Neither moved to seek shelter, both recognizing that this conversation was too important to interrupt. What if I can't share? Isabel asked quietly. What if I'm too damaged, too jealous, too broken to be the generous sister you want me to be? Then we'll work on it, Thea replied. All three of us together. Families aren't born perfect, Isabel. They become perfect through forgiveness and effort and choosing each other every day. Even when it's hard, lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating their faces in the strange, silvery light that comes before a storm. In that moment, both father and daughter could see the possibility of something new, not a return to what had been lost, but the creation of something different and potentially beautiful. I should apologize to her, Isabel said reluctantly. Yes, you should. But first, you should understand that she's probably packing right now, convinced that her presence here was a mistake from the beginning. Was it? Isabel asked. A mistake? Theo considered the question seriously. No, she saved me from becoming a bitter old man who lived in the past. She reminded me that I still had something to offer, still had love to give. If that's a mistake, it's the best mistake I ever made. The rain was falling harder now, soaking their clothes and streaming down their faces. But neither moved to take shelter, both recognizing that this moment, this honest recognition of pain and possibility, was too precious to abandon for mere comfort. "I'll try," Isabel said finally. "I can't promise I'll be gracious about it, but I'll try to see her as something other than a replacement. That's all I can ask," Theo replied. "Now come on. Let's get out of this rain and see if we can convince a 12-year-old girl that she still has a home here." The rain that had begun during Isabel's confrontation with her father continued through the night, drumming against the cabin roof where Fiona sat on her narrow bed, staring at the flour sack she had packed and repacked 3 times. Each time she folded her few possessions, she found herself pulling them out again, unable to make the final commitment to leaving. The Blackwood family Bible lay open on Theo's desk in the main house. Its pages turned to the family records where generations of births, deaths and marriages had been carefully inscribed in fading ink. Theo sat before it with pen in hand, having written and rewritten Fiona's name a dozen times on a separate piece of paper, practicing the moment when he would make her legally part of his family. The adoption papers, prepared weeks earlier by his lawyer in town, waited in the desk drawer. All they needed was his signature and a judge's approval. But now those documents seemed as fragile as the peace that had settled over his ranch before Isabel's return. In the guest room upstairs, Isabel lay awake listening to the storm. Her traveling clothes hung carefully in the wardrobe that had once held her mother's dresses. The room felt like a museum of her childhood, the same quilt on the bed, the same view of the mountains from the window, the same sense of being suspended between past and future. She had not expected the conversation with her father to go as it had. She had prepared for anger, defensiveness, perhaps even the desperate pleading of a man caught in an inappropriate situation. Instead, she had found a quiet strength that was new to him, a sense of purpose that had been entirely absent 7 years ago. The girl complicated everything. Isabel had arrived prepared to reclaim her place in her father's life, to rebuild their relationship on her terms. But Fiona's presence meant that any reconciliation would have to include someone else. Someone who had already established a claim on Theo's affections that Isabel wasn't sure she was generous enough to share. Dawn came grey and subdued, the storm having passed but leaving behind a world washed clean and somehow different than it had been the day before. Fiona rose early as always, but for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she did not immediately begin preparing breakfast. Instead, she sat at her small table and composed a letter, something she had never had reason to write before. "Dear Mr. Theo," she began, then scratched it out and started again. "Dear Father," she wrote, then crossed that out too, unable to claim a title that Isabel's return had thrown into question. "Mr. Theodore, I want you to know that the months I spent here were the happiest of my life. You gave me more than just food and shelter. You gave me dignity, purpose, and the closest thing to a father's love I've ever known. I understand now that I was never meant to stay permanently, that I was simply keeping a place warm until your real daughter could return. I don't blame you for this, and I don't want you to feel guilty about it. You saved my life in every way that matters, and I'll be grateful for that always. I'm leaving this morning before anyone else is awake, because goodbyes are too hard, and I don't want to cause more trouble between you and Miss Isabel. She's your blood daughter, and she deserves to have her father to herself without having to share him with an orphan girl who has no real claim on the Blackwood name. Please don't look for me. I'm older now and wiser than I was when I first arrived, and I'll find my way just fine. Maybe someday when I'm grown and have a family of my own, I'll come back to visit and show you how well everything turned out. Thank you for teaching me that I'm worth caring about. That's a gift I'll carry with me wherever I go. With all my love, Fiona Peterson." She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table where Theo would find it when he came to check on her. as he did every morning. Then she shouldered her flour sack and opened the cabin door, stepping into the cool morning air that smelled of rain and new beginnings. But she had underestimated how well Theo had come to know her habits. He was waiting by the porch of the main house, dressed and alert, despite the early hour. "Going somewhere?" he asked quietly. Fiona stopped in her tracks, her carefully planned escape thwarted by the man who had become far too important to her for clean departures. "It's for the best. Mr. Theo, Miss Isabel was right about a lot of things. I don't belong here, not really. I was just borrowing a place until the real family could be put back together." "And who decided what the real family looks like?" The question caught her off guard. "Well, I mean, she's your daughter, your blood daughter. She is. And so are you, in every way that matters." Theo approached slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "Fiona, I want you to listen to me very carefully. The family I want isn't the one I lost 7 years ago. That family was broken by grief and blame and things that can't be undone. The family I want is the one we can build together, all three of us, if we're brave enough to try. But Miss Isabel is scared and hurting and lashing out at the safest target she can find. But underneath all that anger, she's still the daughter I love, just like you're still the daughter I love. Love doesn't diminish when it's shared. Fiona, it multiplies." The flour sack felt heavier in her hands as she struggled with the terrible hope his words stirred in her heart. "What if she can't learn to accept me? What if having me here makes it impossible for you two to rebuild what you've lost? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I won't make decisions based on fear of what might go wrong. I did that once, and I lost 7 years with my daughter because of it." From the upstairs window, Isabel watched this conversation unfold. She had risen early herself, drawn by some instinct that told her this morning would bring a crisis that would define all their futures. Seeing her father fight for the girl with the same quiet determination he had never shown in fighting, for her created a complex knot of emotions she wasn't sure she could untangle. The girl clearly loved him, that was evident, in every line of her posture. Every word of their conversation that drifted up through the open window. And he loved her too, with a paternal tenderness that Isabel remembered from her own childhood. Before grief and guilt had hardened him into someone she no longer recognized, the realization that struck her was as unwelcome as it was undeniable. Her father had not replaced her with Fiona. He had learned, through caring for Fiona, how to be the father he should have been all along. The man she had hated for 7 years, the man who had let grief paralyze him, who had chosen solitude over fighting for his daughter, that man was gone. In his place was someone who would stand in the morning rain and refuse to let someone he loved walk away without a fight. Downstairs, the conversation continued. "I have the adoption papers ready," Theo said. "All they need is my signature and a judge's approval. I was planning to make it official this week, before Isabel arrived. Her being here doesn't change that plan unless you want it to." Fiona's eyes widened. "You really mean it? Even with her home now?" "Especially with her home now. She needs to understand that this family has room for both of you, that love shared is love multiplied, not divided. And if she can't accept that?" Theo's expression grew sad but resolute. "Then she'll make her own choice about whether to stay or go. But I won't sacrifice one daughter to appease another. That's not how families should work." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Isabel appeared on the porch, dressed but looking uncertain in a way that made her seem younger than her 25 years. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said, her voice carefully controlled. I think we need to talk. All three of us, together." Fiona looked between father and daughter, seeing something in Isabel's expression that hadn't been there the day before. Not acceptance exactly, but a willingness to try that was perhaps even more valuable. "I made coffee," Isabel continued, and there was something almost pleading in the simple statement. "And I found ingredients for breakfast, though I should warn you that my cooking skills are limited." It was an olive branch, tentatively offered, and Fiona recognized it as such. "I could help," she said quietly. If you'd like, I'd like that very much. As the three of them moved toward the house, Theo carried the family Bible from his desk to the kitchen table. Its worn leather cover and faded pages spoke of generations of Blackwoods who had faced their own challenges, their own moments of choosing between fear and hope. "Before we go any further," he said, setting the Bible down where all three of them could see it, "I want you both to understand something. This book contains the record of every Blackwood for 4 generations. Births, deaths, marriages, all the moments that define a family's history." He opened to the page where family records were kept, pointing to names inscribed in careful script. "I want to add Fiona's name to these pages. Not as a ward or a dependent, but as my daughter legally and in every other way that matters. And I want both of you to understand that this decision isn't about replacing anyone or filling any emptiness. It's about recognizing what's already true in my heart." Isabel stared at the page where her own birth had been recorded 25 years earlier. Her mother's death noted in the same careful script just 7 years past. The thought of another name being added, another daughter being acknowledged, stirred feelings too complex to sort through quickly. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "if I accept her as my sister, what does that mean for us, for our relationship?" "It means we build something new," Theo replied. "Not a recreation of what we lost, but something different and potentially better. It means we learn to be a family that includes rather than excludes, that grows rather than diminishes." Fiona stood silent through this exchange, afraid to speak, afraid to hope, afraid to do anything that might tip the delicate balance toward rejection rather than acceptance. Finally, Isabel looked directly at her for the first time since the confrontation the day before. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I said things yesterday that were cruel and unfair. You're not responsible for the problems between my father and me, and you don't deserve to be punished for them. You don't need to," Fiona began. But Isabel held up a hand. "Yes, I do. I need to say this, and you need to hear it. You're not a replacement for anyone, and this house is not a consolation prize for my father. You've built something real here, something that matters. And I was wrong to try to tear it down just because it threatened my own sense of entitlement." The words were stilted, clearly difficult for her to say, but they carried the weight of genuine remorse. "Thank you," Fiona said quietly. "That means a lot. I can't promise I'll be easy to live with," Isabel continued. "I've spent 7 years nursing grievances and building walls around my heart. But I'd like to try to learn how to be a sister, if you're willing to be patient with me." Fiona looked at this woman who held so much power over her future, seeing not the cold sophisticate who had arrived yesterday, but someone as lost and wounded as she had been when she first walked up the ranch road months ago. "I'd like that," she said simply, and as the three of them stood around the kitchen table with the family Bible open before them, all of them could feel the weight of the moment. The sense of standing at a crossroads where the choices they made would echo through all their tomorrows. The next morning brought visitors that would test their newfound commitment to building a family together. Doc Morrison arrived first, driving his familiar buggy up the ranch road with the measured pace of someone who had important business to conduct. Behind him, in a more official-looking carriage, came Judge William Patterson from the territorial court. Along with a clerk carrying an impressive leather satchel, Theo had sent word to town the previous evening that he wished to proceed with the adoption immediately, before any outside forces could complicate the process further. The legal adoption papers lay spread across the kitchen table like a map to their future, waiting only for signatures and official approval. "Morning." "Theo," Doc Morrison called as he climbed down from his buggy. "I brought Judge Patterson as requested, along with young Mr. Hartwell from the clerk's office. Though I should warn you, we passed the Holts on the road about 5 miles back, riding hard in this direction." Theo's jaw tightened. He had hoped to complete the legal formalities before Jeremiah Holt could make good on his threat to return with official backing. Judge Patterson, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind but penetrating eyes, surveyed the scene before him with the careful attention of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected people's lives. He had presided over numerous adoption cases during his years on the bench, but few had generated as much community interest as this one. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge said formally, "I understand you wish to adopt Miss Fiona Peterson as your legal daughter. Before we proceed, I need to speak with all parties involved to ensure this arrangement is in the child's best interest." Fiona stood between Theo and Isabel, feeling the weight of 3 adult gazes focused on her. The adoption papers that would make her legally part of the Blackwood family seemed both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. "Fiona," Judge Patterson said gently, "do you understand what adoption means? What it would mean for you to become Fiona Blackwood instead of Fiona Peterson?" "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "It means Mr. Theo would be my legal father, responsible for my welfare and education. It means I'd have a permanent home and family, not just temporary shelter. And is this what you want?" The simple question carried the weight of her entire future. Fiona looked at Theo, seeing the quiet strength that had protected her for months, then at Isabel, whose presence complicated everything but who had committed to trying to build something new with them. "Yes, sir. More than anything," Judge Patterson turned to Theo. "Mr. Blackwood, you're a man of substantial means and standing in this community. You could easily arrange for Miss Peterson's care in other ways: boarding school, placement with a suitable family, financial support until she reaches majority. Why adoption? Why take on the full legal responsibility of parenthood?" Theo considered the question seriously. "Because she's not an obligation to be managed, Your Honor. She's my daughter in every way that matters to me. She's brought purpose back to my life, reminded me what it means to have family. Making it legal is simply acknowledging what's already true in my heart. And you, Miss Blackwood," the judge addressed Isabel, "how do you feel about your father adopting another daughter? This arrangement will affect inheritance rights, family dynamics, your own relationship with your father." Isabel had been dreading this question, knowing that her answer would be scrutinized not just by the judge, but by her father and Fiona as well. The honest response was complicated. She still struggled with jealousy, still felt threatened by sharing her father's affection, still wondered if there was room in their rebuilt relationship for another daughter, but she had also seen something in the past 2 days that she couldn't deny. Her father had become the man she had always needed him to be, and Fiona was part of that transformation. To tear that down now would be not just cruel, but ultimately self-destructive. "I support the adoption," she said clearly. "Fiona has been good for my father, and I believe he'll be good for her. She deserves a permanent, loving home, and he deserves to be the father I always knew he could be." Judge Patterson nodded approvingly, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the proceedings. Through the kitchen window, they could see the Holts riding into the ranch yard, accompanied by a man in a black suit who could only be a lawyer. "Well," Doc Morrison observed dryly, "this should make things interesting." Jeremiah Holt dismounted with obvious anger, his face flushed from hard riding and frustrated expectations. The lawyer with him was a thin, sharp-featured man who carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through legal intimidation. "Judge Patterson," Jeremiah called out as the group approached the house, "I'm glad you're here. We need to discuss the illegal detention of my cousin's child by this man." "Illegal detention." Theo stepped onto the porch, his voice dangerously quiet. "That's a serious accusation, Holt." "This is my associate, Mr. Charles Whitman, from Helena," Jeremiah continued, ignoring Theo's response. "He's prepared to file formal charges against you for unlawfully keeping a minor child without proper guardianship arrangements." Mr. Whitman stepped forward, removing a set of official-looking documents from his coat. "Your Honor, my clients have blood relationship to the child in question and are prepared to assume full responsibility for her care and upbringing. We contend that Mr. Blackwood's arrangement with the girl is both irregular and potentially harmful to her welfare." Judge Patterson examined the documents with the careful attention they deserved, though his expression remained neutral. "These appear to be properly prepared guardianship papers," he admitted. "Mr. Holt, on what grounds do you claim guardianship rights?" "Blood relationship," Jeremiah replied promptly. "Fiona's father was my cousin. We're her closest living relatives, and we're prepared to provide her with proper family care in an appropriate household setting." "By appropriate household setting," Isabel interjected, her voice carrying an edge of aristocratic disdain, "I assume you mean one where she would work as unpaid domestic help in exchange for basic necessities." Jeremiah's face flushed darker. "That's a slanderous accusation, miss. We're offering the girl a place in a proper Christian family, with moral guidance and suitable employment that will prepare her for adult responsibilities." "Suitable employment," Theo repeated, his tone making the words sound obscene. "She's 12 years old enough to contribute to her own support." Catherine Holt spoke for the first time. "We're not running a charity, Mr. Blackwood. The girl needs to learn that nothing in this world comes free." Judge Patterson had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, his trained eye taking in not just the legal arguments, but the underlying motivations of all parties involved. "Mr. Holt," he said formally, "while blood relationship is certainly a factor in guardianship decisions, it is not the only factor. The court's primary concern is the welfare of the child. Can you demonstrate that your household would provide better care than Miss Peterson is currently receiving?" "Better care?" Mr. Whitman interrupted. "Your Honor, surely you can see the impropriety of an unmarried man raising a young girl without female supervision or moral guidance." "There is female supervision," Isabel said coolly. "I live here now, and I can assure you that Fiona receives not just moral guidance, but also education, affection, and opportunities that would be unavailable in any other arrangement." This declaration, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed, clearly surprised the Holts. They had not expected opposition from Theo's own daughter. "Miss Blackwood," Judge Patterson addressed her directly, "you're willing to testify that you support your father's adoption of Miss Peterson and that you will help provide appropriate female guidance in her upbringing?" "I am, Your Honor. Fiona is my sister in every way that matters, and I'll do everything in my power to ensure she receives the love and opportunities she deserves." The words surprised Isabel herself as she spoke them, but she realized they were completely true. Somewhere in the past few days, her feelings toward Fiona had shifted from resentment to something approaching genuine sisterly protection. Judge Patterson studied the adoption papers before him, then looked around the kitchen that had become an impromptu courtroom. His decision would determine not just Fiona's future, but the future of this unlikely family that had fought so hard to stay together. "I'm prepared to make my ruling," he announced, and the room fell silent as everyone waited to learn whether love would prove stronger than law, whether chosen family would triumph over blood relationship, whether the bonds forged through care and commitment would be recognized as legally binding. The adoption papers lay on the table between all the competing claims, waiting for a signature that would either validate months of growing love or render them meaningless in the face of legal technicalities. Judge Patterson set down the legal documents and looked directly at Fiona, who stood between her chosen family and her blood relatives like a bridge between two different futures. "Miss Peterson," he said gravely, "before I make my decision, I need to hear from you directly, without any adult speaking for you. In your own words, where do you want to live and why?" The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pasture. Fiona felt the weight of every gaze in the room, but most heavily, she felt the hope and fear radiating from Theo and Isabel, who had committed themselves to including her in their rebuilt family. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "When I first came to this ranch, I was half-starved and desperate. I'd been walking for days, sleeping in barns when I could find them, going hungry more often than not. I came here not because I expected charity, but because I had something to offer in exchange for shelter, She paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage. Mr. Teo didn't just give me food and a roof over my head. He gave me dignity. He treated me like my work had value, like my opinions mattered, like I was worth teaching and protecting and caring about. When I had nightmares about losing my parents, he sat with me. When I wanted to learn to read better, he helped me. When people in town said cruel things about our arrangement, he defended me. Jeremiah Holt shifted impatiently. But Judge Patterson held up a hand for silence. Miss Isabel, Fiona continued, looking directly at the young woman who had become such an important part of her hopes for the future. She came home to find a stranger living in her house, sleeping in what might have been her space, sharing her father's attention. She had every right to resent me, to demand that I leave. Instead, she chose to see me as someone worth including in her family, someone worth calling sister. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the words coming from a place of deep certainty she hadn't known she possessed. The Holts are my blood relatives, and I don't dispute that. But they never showed any interest in my welfare when my parents were dying, never offered help when I was left alone, never even inquired about my survival, until they learned there might be property involved. They want me now not because they love me, but because they see me as useful labor and a potential source of inheritance money. Catherine Holt's face flushed with anger, but she remained silent under Judge Patterson's stern gaze. Family isn't just about blood, Your Honor. It's about choosing to care for each other every day, about making sacrifices for each other's welfare, about building something together that's stronger than what any of you could create alone. The Blackwoods have shown me that kind of family. They've chosen me, and I choose them. Judge Patterson nodded slowly, then turned to address the Holts and their lawyer. Mr. Holt, Mr. Whitman, while I acknowledge your blood relationship to Miss Peterson, I find your claims to guardianship unconvincing. You've presented no evidence that your household would provide better care than she currently receives, and your own testimony suggests that your interest in the child is primarily economic rather than emotional. Mr. Whitman started to object, but the judge continued. Furthermore, Miss Peterson is old enough to express her own preferences regarding her care, and her wishes carry significant weight in my determination. She has clearly articulated not just where she wants to live, but why, and her reasoning demonstrates the kind of mature judgment that argues for honoring her choice. The lawyer made one last attempt. Your Honor, surely the court recognizes the importance of blood relationships in determining. The court recognizes that the best interests of the child supersede all other considerations, Judge Patterson interrupted firmly. And in this case, those interests are clearly served by allowing her to remain with the family she has chosen, and that has chosen her. He picked up his pen and turned to the adoption papers spread before him. Mr. Blackwood, I find your petition for adoption to be in the best interests of Miss Peterson and in accordance with territorial law. I hereby approve the adoption of Fiona Peterson by Theodore Blackwood, with all the rights and responsibilities thereof. The pen scratched across the official documents, making marks that would transform a frightened orphan girl into Fiona Blackwood, legally and permanently part of a family that had fought to keep her. Furthermore, the judge continued, I order that these proceedings be recorded in the territorial records, and I warn all parties that any further attempts to interfere with this family arrangement will be viewed as contempt of court. The Holt's faces showed their defeat and frustration, but they had no legal recourse. Their lawyer gathered his papers with obvious displeasure, muttering about appeals that everyone in the room knew would fail. Congratulations, Judge Patterson said, standing and extending his hand to Theo. You now have 2 daughters. Mr. Blackwood, I trust you'll continue to provide them both with the love and guidance they deserve. As the officials prepared to leave and the Holts departed with bitter words and empty threats, the 3 Blackwoods found themselves alone in the kitchen that had served as an impromptu courtroom. The adoption papers, now signed and official, lay on the table like a bridge between their uncertain past and their hopeful future. Well, Isabel said with a shaky laugh. "I suppose that makes us sisters now, officially." She reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought this from San Francisco, thinking it might be appropriate if things worked out." She handed the package to Fiona, who unwrapped it carefully to reveal a dress of deep green cotton, simply cut but beautifully made, with pearl buttons and delicate embroidered flowers along the collar. "I thought you might like something new to wear," Isabel said, her voice uncertain. "Something that belongs only to you, not handed down or borrowed or made do. Something to mark your new beginning as a Blackwood." Fiona held the dress against herself, feeling the quality of the fabric and seeing the care that had gone into its selection. But more than the gift itself, she treasured what it represented: acceptance, sisterhood, and the promise of a future where she would be valued not for her usefulness but for herself. "Thank you," she whispered, tears of joy finally spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you both for fighting for me, for choosing me, for making me part of your family." Theo wrapped both his daughters in an embrace that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. Through the kitchen window, the Montana landscape stretched toward the horizon, endless and full of possibility. But for the first time in any of their lives, none of them felt the need to look toward that horizon. They had found what they were searching for right here, in each other, in the family they had chosen to create together. The new dress would hang in Fiona's wardrobe as a symbol of her acceptance into the Blackwood family. But the real transformation had already taken place in the hearts of three people who had learned that love shared is indeed love multiplied, and that the strongest families are often those built not on blood, but on commitment, forgiveness, and the daily choice to care for one another. 6 months later, the first snows of winter dusted the Montana landscape like a blessing, covering the ranch in pristine white that sparkled under the late afternoon sun. The kitchen of the Blackwood house had become the heart of something beautiful, a place where three very different people had learned to move around each other with the practiced ease of a family that had grown together through choice and commitment rather than mere circumstance. Fiona stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew that filled the house with rich, warming aromas. At 15 months past her 13th birthday, she had grown taller and more confident, carrying herself with the quiet assurance of someone who knew she belonged exactly where she was. The green dress Isabel had given her hung carefully in her wardrobe, worn on special occasions. But today, she wore a simple blue cotton dress that Isabel had helped her choose during their monthly trips to town. At the kitchen table, Isabel worked on the books for the ranch, her head bent over columns of figures that she managed with the same efficiency she had once applied to her business ventures in San Francisco. She had sold her interest there and committed fully to life in Montana, discovering that she had inherited more of her father's aptitude for ranch management than she had ever realized. Her hair was pinned back practically, and her clothes were simpler than the elegant styles she had once favored. But there was a peace in her face that had been absent during her years in the city. "The cattle sales this fall were exceptional," she said, looking up from the ledger. "We cleared nearly 30% more profit than last year." Fiona's cooking probably had something to do with that, Theo replied from his chair by the fire, where he was carefully writing in a small leather-bound book. "The buyers from Denver specifically asked if we'd be serving another one of her meals when they come back in the spring." The recipe book that served as this chapter's central artifact had been Fiona's idea, though it had grown into something much more significant than she had originally intended. What began as a simple collection of her mother's recipes had evolved into a comprehensive record of the meals, traditions, and memories that defined their new family life. Each recipe was written in Fiona's careful script, but the margins were filled with notes from all three of them: Theo's suggestions for modifications, Isabel's observations about which dishes were most popular with guests, and Fiona's own annotations about seasonal variations and special occasions. It had become a living document of their shared life, a testament to how they had blended their different backgrounds into something uniquely their own. Mrs. Henderson asked me to teach her daughter Sarah how to make your cornbread, Isabel said, returning to the financial records. Apparently, young Tom Morrison has been visiting their house more frequently since he tasted it at the church social. Fiona blushed slightly but smiled. At 13, she was beginning to notice the attention of boys her own age, though she remained focused primarily on her family and her growing reputation as the finest cook in 3 counties. "I don't mind teaching her," she said. "Mama always said that sharing recipes was like sharing love. The more you gave away, the more you had." The mention of Fiona's mother no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Through months of patient love from her adoptive family, she had learned to remember Margaret Peterson with gratitude rather than grief, to honor her memory by living fully rather than dwelling in loss. Theo looked up from his writing, his reading having improved dramatically under Fiona's gentle tutoring. The shame he had once felt about his educational limitations had transformed into pride at what he had accomplished through hard work and dedication. "I've been thinking about expanding. The house come spring," he said, "adding a proper dining room for when we have large groups of guests and maybe a sitting room where we can entertain visitors more formally." "Are we expecting more visitors?" Isabel asked with amusement. "Doc Morrison thinks we should consider turning part of the ranch into a sort of school," Theo replied. "Not a formal institution, but a place where orphaned children could learn practical skills while living in a family environment. Fiona's proven that children thrive when they're given purpose and belonging, rather than just charity." The idea had been growing in all their minds over the past months. They had seen how Fiona had blossomed under their care, and the thought of providing similar opportunities to other children in need appealed to their sense of justice and their understanding of how powerful chosen family could be. "I'd like that," Fiona said quietly. "I remember what it felt like to be alone and frightened, not knowing where your next meal would come from or if anyone would ever want you around. If we could spare other children that feeling, it would be worth whatever effort it took. It wouldn't be easy," Isabel warned, though her tone suggested she was already planning rather than objecting. "We'd need to be careful about which children we took in. Make sure we could provide properly for them, deal with legal complications and community attitudes. Nothing worthwhile is easy," Theo replied, echoing words that had become a family motto. "But look what we've built here. If 3 people can become a family through choice and commitment, imagine what we could accomplish with more." As evening deepened and the snow continued to fall, the 3 Blackwoods gathered around the table for their evening meal. It had become their custom to share not just food, but reflections on the day, plans for the future, and gratitude for what they had found together. "To family," Theo said, raising his glass of milk in a toast that had become their ritual. "To family," Isabel and Fiona replied in unison, their voices blending in harmony that spoke of months of practice at being together. Outside, the wind whispered through the prairie grass, and snow fell steadily, covering the world in peaceful silence. But inside the warm kitchen, 3 people who had found each other against all odds continued the daily work of being a family, sharing meals and dreams, supporting each other through difficulties, and building a future that honored both their individual gifts and their collective strength. The recipe book lay open on the counter, its pages filled with the accumulated wisdom of their shared life. Tomorrow, Fiona would add the recipe for tonight's stew, along with notes about the conversation that had accompanied it and the dreams they had shared over the meal. Future generations of Blackwoods, adopted and biological alike, would be able to read not just instructions for preparing food, but the story of how a lonely widower, an estranged daughter, and an orphaned girl had discovered that the most important ingredient in any recipe for happiness is the willingness to make room at the table for one more. In years to come, when other lost children found their way to the Blackwood Ranch, they would discover what Fiona had learned that first morning when she offered her only skill in exchange for shelter. That sometimes the greatest gift you can give is simply the courage to say, "I don't talk much, sir, but I can cook, And sometimes the greatest blessing you can receive is someone who responds. That's all I need. The snow continued to fall, gentle and persistent, covering the Montana landscape in pristine beauty. But the real transformation had already taken place inside the warm house, where three hearts had learned to beat in rhythm with each other, where three different histories had merged into one shared future, and where the simple act of sharing a meal had created something far more nourishing than food, a family built on love, choice, and the daily commitment to care for one another.